Hello, and welcome to the Providence College podcast. I'm your host, Liz Kay, and I'm joined by producer Chris Judge of the class of 2005. Here on the Providence College podcast, we bring you interesting stories from the Fryer family. This week, we have the pleasure of speaking with Sara Corben, a member of the class of 2014. Sara's day job is in global brand development at Hasbro, but in 2021, she launched the Weird Island podcast, chronicling the strangest tales in Rhode Island history, with episodes on unsolved mysteries, conspiracy theories, weird history, and even murder. Since then, she and the podcast have become a media sensation with features in the Providence Journal and the Boston Globe. Sara, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Please share the origin story of Weird Island with us.
Yeah, no problem. So I started the podcast, I think it was, I'm terrible with time, but about a year and a half ago, when kind of we were in the heart of the pandemic still, wasn't really going anywhere, doing too much outside of my house. I was working from home, working out from home, not seeing a ton of people, and was kind of looking for a project to keep me from going a little stir crazy. I knew I was listening to tons of podcasts, like 5 hours a day of podcasts, which is ridiculous while I was doing work. It's a little embarrassing to admit that. So I knew I wanted to create some sort of podcast and had kind of started to brainstorm what that could look like, what the subject could be. I listened to a lot of true crime, and I knew for sure I should not do a true crime podcast because I was starting to get a little bit paranoid even just listening to a lot of true crime. And I thought if I really immerse myself in looking more into that, I am going to be unable to sleep. So I was talking with my family, and actually my dad suggested the idea that kind of kickstarted this. He works for a Rhode Island company called FM Global, and that company has some long history in Rhode Island related to Rhode Island's many mills. So he had said, you should do a podcast all about Rhode Island mills. It's a little bit too granular for me. I was like, I think I want to go a little broader than that. And so I ended up really liking the heart of the idea, which is something Rhode Island based, and blowing it out a little bit bigger.
So where do you get your ideas?
Initially, it was a lot of just searching on my own. So started with a pretty basic Google search. Pretty much everything starts with a basic Google search. And, check some books out of the library, books on, compilations of weird history, weird facts, weird places in Rhode Island. And I started with a list of maybe around 50 ideas, some that were better than others. And that's where I really started it off. Since then, I've gotten a ton of ideas from listeners. So I'm up to about 200 ideas on the list right now. And that's not counting the ones that I've already covered. So most of those, I would say, are coming from listeners who are reaching out on Instagram or email to suggest ideas.
So walk us through how you create each episode. How do you do your research? How much time do they take to produce?
They are pretty quick turnaround. I'm sure you do the same thing creating this podcast. Typically, so I was doing weekly episodes. I have spread it out a little bit to be every other week right now because I'm in a pretty busy time at work. But typically it starts with, like I said, basic Google search. Let me get the lay of the land on a subject. And then I'll really start to tease things apart that I've found from that basic Google search. I'll kind of highlight some areas where I want to dig in deeper. I'll look for, archives. I'll look at libraries and try and find ways to corroborate facts that I have found initially. There's a lot of stuff on the internet that is super questionable. So a lot of my time is spent just trying to verify things, which is very tedious, but I enjoy it quite a bit. The turnaround time is generally about 1 week of really focused effort. Like I said, right now I'm kind of spacing them out to be every other week so that I don't get too burnt out, but they're pretty quick turnaround.
So I think we've teased our listeners enough. Tell us about the stories. Which ones are your favorites? Which ones have you found to be the most surprising or unusual?
I think I initially started with some ones that I think everybody would be really interested in. Rhode Island's got some really interesting history that is pretty unusual. Rhode Island's got some local vampires, which was one I knew right off the bat. I have to do a vampire story. I'm not going to spoil the whole story of it, but that was one that kind of I knew everyone would be interested in. There are others that I was more surprised by, especially a lot of listener suggestions. So we've got some pretty cool suggestions for things that you might not initially think were weird. One listener suggested the highest point in Rhode Island as an interesting story. If you've ever been to the highest point in Rhode Island, you'll know it's not very high. So I was like, I don't know if that'll be a really good story. But it had this kind of secret history about this reason why it was very difficult to get to that highest point in Rhode Island for quite a while, based on someone who lived nearby it and didn't want people going on the land. And so those stories that like come out of nowhere and surprise you, I think are the ones that I've been the most excited about. So they vary from, like I said, vampires and rune stones. There's these stones in Rhode Island with markings that are kind of mysterious that no one totally understands where they came from, to like a cement wall that has a secret backstory that you might never know about. So pretty varied.
And the format kind of differs from episode to episode. I listened to a few where it sounded like you had written it out and basically just recorded it, and others where you include interviews, like the infamous story of the difference between the intersection of Ridge and Pidge Avenue in Pawtucket.
I would say I would love to do more of those interview episodes. Those are my favorites. The ones that I've gotten to have guests on, I think are the most captivating stories. So that was something I'd like to do a little bit more of. Don't do a ton of it because of bandwidth right now, to be honest. I'm sure you face this on your podcast. Scheduling people can be very difficult. But I think those are really captivating. And then the kind of flip side of it is I'll write kind of a totally scripted story that I've researched all myself.
And who have been some of the guests we mentioned? I mentioned the episode about Ridge and Pidge, the intersection of Ridge and Pidge, where you interviewed a veteran Providence Journal reporter. Who else have you had on as a guest?
One episode I really enjoyed was featuring a church in Woonsocket called St. Anne's. It's actually no longer a church today. It's St. Anne's Art and Cultural Center. But this church was really funded and built by all of the parishioners and has these incredible frescoes on the wall, like floor to ceiling, just artwork everywhere. It's beautiful. And so I had the team there come on the podcast and talk about the stories behind the frescoes. Not to spoil it, but all of the people on the walls are real people who went to the church. So they all have like rich stories behind every single person on the wall. That was one of my favorite episodes I've ever done. I also had on, I've had people talking about ghosts, so some local ghost experts. I had a pumpkin grower who is famous for growing these enormous world famous pumpkins. So really like experts in very different areas have come on the podcast.
And I think you alluded to another aspect of this. So you went to visit St. Anne's in Woonsocket? Like, so it seems like the podcast has probably taken you to corners of the state you never would have visited otherwise.
Yeah, definitely. That was another big thing that was appealing about doing a podcast on Rhode Island, particularly during the pandemic, was the idea of getting out and being a tourist locally. Obviously, like everyone else, I wasn't traveling too much during the pandemic. So kind of taking a step back and forcing myself to be a tourist of the state where I've been living for quite a while was really interesting. I've definitely seen a ton of things that I didn't know existed. I like to go to as many places as possible. There have been a few I haven't gone to, but for a couple of reasons, I want to check them out for myself. And I also want to make sure that if I'm telling a story and sending people to a place that it's still there, it's safe. Some places are abandoned. I want to call out like, hey, if you're going to go to this abandoned place, don't go here, or, be safe and watch out for this, just to make sure. That's definitely something particularly with abandoned place. I want to make sure I'm not putting people in danger. So a couple different reasons for wanting to go.
So if people were taking a brief visit to Providence College, say for homecoming weekend, which is coming up September 29th to October 2nd, what are a few episodes that you would recommend they check out, and possibly go visit the locations themselves? Any places close to campus, maybe?
Oh, that's a very good question. There are a couple classics that I think if you're in town for a short while, be worth checking out. I did an episode on Waterfire. Waterfire is very iconic for Providence, but the story of how Providence's downtown evolved and changed since the 70s and 80s, I think is kind of interesting to hear, and then walk around downtown and see, what it looks like today. So I would definitely recommend that one. There's an episode on Roger Williams, the founder of the state, which I think is really, really fun and interesting to kind of understand the origin of the state, as well as really the story centers around this apple tree that grew down into his grave and supposedly consumed his body and took on the shape of Roger Williams. You can go visit the apple tree root. It's at the John Brown House and Museum in downtown. So that's kind of a cool one to get some history of the state and this quirky little fact, and then go see the root, which they preserved. So those are two I would definitely recommend.
And so what if you've got more time? Like if you are a Providence College student who will be here for the academic year, or if you're a local alum, what else would you recommend listening to and then going to check out?
Yeah, let me think about that. I think if you're local, I don't know if I felt this way when I was a student because I didn't have a car for most of my college days, but as just a local driving around often, I drive by the Apex department store all the time. And for a long time, I wondered what that was. I think if you're a local, that story is definitely one worth knowing.
So that is a really iconic department store that's shaped like a pyramid that you can see in the southern part of Pawtucket on off 95, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, thank you for that.
I think you mentioned this, that you just got started during the pandemic. What's your podcast setup like? Where are you recording? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's not anything fancy. I record in my living room. I have just my one microphone that is really just like a pretty basic microphone. It cost me $50 when I got it. And I've got my laptop. So it's nothing super out there for setup. I know a lot of podcasters have much more elaborate and sophisticated equipment, but I think if anyone listening has any interest in starting a podcast, it can be done very easily and cheaply as you're just getting started.
As a PC student, you worked on WDOM. Did that experience influence the creation of Weird Island in any way?
Yeah, I think so. I loved having a radio show. It was very different from what I'm doing on the podcast today. When I had the radio show, it was at like 6 a.m. on a Thursday, I think. So many. Yeah, it was really popular. It was really fun. I think at the time I really was not accustomed to waking up that early. It's probably the only day of the week where I would see the sunrise. So I have fond memories of kind of getting up early and, trudging up to the radio station in my pajamas. And we just mostly played music and, chit chatted. So very different in format, but I think it was the first time I really put myself out there and tried to portray a little bit of confidence. I don't know if I necessarily actually felt it at the time, but first time really putting myself out there. So that definitely planted the seeds for kind of developing a little bit more confidence talking to people, on the radio and on the internet.
I think it's important to mention that you were not a history major at PC, but you studied marketing. Tell us a little bit about your day job at Hasbro.
I work at Hasbro, the toy company, not the hospital, which I feel like you only need to say that in Rhode Island. But I work in marketing on the toy side of the business. So there's within Hasbro, lots of different types of marketers. Working on the toy side means I'm kind of integrated into all of the product development on the brand that I work on, which is Transformers. So I feel incredibly lucky because what that means is I get to play with toys all day long. And that's just super fun and definitely something I dreamed of doing when I was at PC. Didn't know if it was actually going to happen. So I feel very, very lucky that my dream job actually came to life.
It's what's it like to work for such a recognizable brand? Did you grow up with Transformers yourself, or did you have friends who played with them, siblings?
I didn't actually grow up with Transformers, to be honest. I'm trying to think of, I don't even think that my brother had Transformers really. But I, of course, knew the brand, was aware of it, saw the cartoon, but didn't necessarily have the toys. When I came to Hasbro, I initially started working on Beyblade, which is a another brand. These are tops. I don't know if you've ever played with Beyblade before. And then moved over onto Transformers and felt super lucky, but also very intimidated because I didn't have that history playing with them as a kid. So just on the down low, tried to research and become an expert without anyone knowing that I didn't have that kind of history playing with the brand. But it's amazing to work on a recognizable brand that, people hear it and they just get excited. And I love talking about work. So
like I'm just revealing a generational difference between the two of us. But as you mentioned, I think there are very avid fans of this brand, people who grew up with the cartoons, watch the movies. How have you interacted with them, and what's it like, getting their feedback on a regular basis?
It's super cool working on a fan-oriented brand. I do work particularly, so our team is split into fan and kid. I work on kid toys, and then we have, a very strong fan-driven side of the business as well. We go to things like Comic-Con. So I was recently at San Diego Comic-Con, and just interacting with people who care so much about a brand or thing is the most amazing feeling. I think talking to people who just grew up loving Transformers is super inspirational. So it makes going into work and doing what we do every day just fun to know that it really means something to someone, both the adults who played with it as kids and the kids who are growing up right now.
So as a marketing major at PC, what courses or experiences did you have that you thought you think helped you particularly with your career now?
Well, a couple of things. I actually had a teacher who had worked at Hasbro previously. I took a class, I think it was a marketing class with Professor Bazigian. So that was like the first time I really kind of had the idea planted in my head that, I could work at Hasbro someday. So that definitely stuck with me, kind of hearing about his experiences, which just seemed so incredible. So on that side, definitely influenced where I ended up in my career. I also took a lot of art classes when I was at PC, which I don't specifically do anything really art related right now, but having those foundational skills as a marketer are really helpful. I don't think I realized how much of my job would be making PowerPoints, and how important it is that they look beautiful and communicate the right ideas. So I would actually say that I use a lot of that art side, which I wasn't really sure if I would or not. I just loved taking the classes at the time.
It's funny to think how even just getting familiar with the tools, like, can help you work with people who work with those tools. Like, you might not use, the Adobe Suite or Photoshop or InDesign yourself, but it can help you in your conversations with people who use those every day, possibly.
Yeah, 100%. That's so huge. Especially a lot of my job is kind of a intermediary between product design and packaging design and branding. And you can definitely see when someone doesn't have a background in working in the programs that, a designer might use. Because oftentimes you'll hear people say like, that'll take 2 seconds to Photoshop, right? And knowing how long and how complicated a lot of what those teams are doing, I think is really important in making sure that you're not making unrealistic demands as a marketer. So I definitely value having that experience.
Just the vocabulary, right? Of just like using the right terms to have that authority, for sure.
Yeah.
So what brought you to Providence College in the first place?
I actually came to Providence a few times when I was a kid. I used to come to Pawtucket to go to Paw Sox games. And we would come to water fires sometimes. And I remember going to a water fire when I was in high school. I think we had family in town and had kind of taken the drive down to Providence. I grew up in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and just thinking that the city was so beautiful and so alive with that water fire. And that was something that kind of stuck with me when I was looking at schools. I kind of came down to 3 different schools I was torn between. I think it was Emerson and Boston was one, and Babson. I can't remember what town Babson is in right now, and then Providence College. And I think a big part of it was just having fallen in love with the city of Providence itself. That really helped me make that final decision.
That's really an interesting observation, because I mean, I think people think of Boston as sort of like a iconic college destination, but like you really had a gut feeling that Providence would be a good city to be in, even more than just the campus.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's on the horizon for you and for Weird Island? Can you give us a sneak peek of episodes that are in the works, or like other projects you might be working on?
I am, like I said, kind of going week to week. So I'm usually flying by the seat of my pants. Currently working on an episode about the history of the first oyster and ale house in Rhode Island. So researching oysters this morning, which is really interesting. Learning some facts I wish I hadn't learned, like that they're still alive when you eat them. Really unfortunate to know. So I'm pretty excited about that episode. I don't generally plan out further than my next week's episode because I like to pick whatever I'm most excited about that week. It makes the process of really diving in deep and obsessing over something easier when I don't feel like when I feel like I've chosen something that I'm just excited about in the moment. I don't really have like more broadly any big plans for the podcast other than just continuing to do it because I love doing it, and just seeing where it goes.
And are there any personal projects that you're working on that, now that you're more familiar and comfortable with the mic?
Yeah, I'm also working on a project with my grandfather, capturing some family history, which I'm pretty excited about. Basically, we're just recording together. He's telling stories about his childhood, things that were going on, early in his life, and kind of connecting what his personal experience was with kind of the bigger historical moments going on. So I don't know what I'm going to do with that necessarily, if it'll just be for myself and my family, or if I'll end up putting it out there at some point. But that's kind of the other big project I'm working on that I'm excited about.
I think it's interesting to note that, again, like this is a project you can do, that it connects you with your family, that, you didn't have to make a huge financial or time investment to do, but like you can do it while your grandfather is still here and with us to capture those stories, which is amazing.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Sarah, it's been wonderful chatting with you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Subscribe to the Providence College podcast in all the usual places, including iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, as well as your smart speaker. If you like what you hear, please review and share with others. Thanks for listening, and go Friars.